Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome, very warm welcome to Uncover. My name's Josh. I'm a member of the Christian Union, and it's really fantastic to see you here. My pleasure to welcome you. Uncover is a week of events exploring some of the big issues of life and faith. And so every lunchtime this week, we're considering some of life's big questions, and then in these evening events, we're looking at the life that Jesus offers and the claims that he makes about himself. Well, this evening's title is Uncovering Meaning, and in exploring that topic, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Tim Keller, who'll be with us for the whole of this evening's series. Tim's a New York Times best-selling author, and he leads a church in Manhattan. Tim will speak for about 30 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions you have. So please do be texting in your questions throughout the evening using the number that will be on the screen throughout. After that, we'll hear from Holly, who's a student at LMH, about how she began to grapple with some of these issues for herself. And then after Tim's offered a few concluding thoughts, we'll enjoy some more live music together. Well, now please join me in welcoming Tim up to speak.
I'm glad to be here every night this week. I was grateful to be asked. I come from a town, Manhattan, the very center of New York City, where people think of Christianity pretty much the way people think about it in Oxford. It's understood that the natural and the social sciences have essentially made God and religion unnecessary, that it's unnecessary for, understanding the world. God and religion is unnecessary for having moral ideals. God and religion is unnecessary for living life well. And therefore, history, in a sense, has moved on. And Christianity, in a sense, is a spent force. That's how it's seen there. That's pretty much how it's seen here. The only problem is if you actually lift up your eyes and look at the way life is being lived around the world, the problem with that idea is that Christianity isn't acting like a spent force. We could start with the numbers. If you take a look at Korea, in the 20th century, Korea went from about 1% Christian to about 40% Christian in 100 years. If you look at China, something like that's beginning to happen in China, which of course is massively bigger, but it's growing explosively in China. In Africa, at the beginning of the 20th century, 9% Christian. At the end of the 20th century, 50%. Just one example is in 1955, there were 16 million Catholics in Africa, and today there's 170 million Catholics in Africa, and that's not even the biggest Christian body. And I don't, even though the numbers are very impressive, I'm not really thinking just about the numbers. I'm thinking of the diversity of the places where Christianity is growing explosively. One of the secularization thesis, which when I was young was just considered just absolutely true, that is that the more technologically advanced, the more industrialized a society gets, the more secular it gets and the less religious it gets. The problem, of course, is that as China is getting more technologically advanced, it's not getting more secular. In fact, if I'm in a really bad mood, and I can be, if somebody says to me, you know, the world's getting more secular, I say, no, some white people are getting more secular, but the rest of the world actually isn't getting more secular. And white people, by the way, are shrinking as a percentage of the population of the world. Now, what has that got to do with you? Though a few of you look white. What has this got to do with you? A lot, because if you're here to try to understand the world as it is, if you're an Oxford student, don't you want to know what the world's really like? Don't you want to live in the real world, not just the world that you'd like to believe in, but the real world? In that case, you need to understand this movement. You need to understand the fact that the world actually largely is not becoming more secular as it gets more technologically advanced. And there's a tendency, I think, for people in Manhattan and Oxford to say, when they actually hear the statistics, at first they're kind of surprised and they realize the secularization thesis is perhaps obsolete, and yet they say, well, the Christianity and religion is growing in less developed countries. Boy, if that isn't a Western imperialistic attitude, and if you would like to be absolutely free of that Western imperialism, stop those thoughts and actually say, I'd like to find out from the people. Instead of imposing my idea on them, I'd like to find out from them what is the reason why so many people are turning in this way, even in our technologically advanced age. And I'm going to try to represent them to you. And in fact, I have some confidence that I will be able to do that. There is a remarkable amount of, at least the things I'm going to talk to you about, there's a remarkable amount of consensus across the world about some things when it comes to Christianity, even though there's plenty of diversity in the Christian movement. And here's what I think most people would say who are flooding into Christianity across the world. They would say everyone needs meaning, satisfaction, freedom, identity, and hope. Meaning, satisfaction, freedom, identity, and hope. And they would say not only does Christianity explain why those are needs, why we can't live without them, not only does Christianity explain why we have those deep needs that we just can't avoid, but it also supplies those needs arguably better than any other view of life, including the secular view. That's what they'd say. And I would like to present that to you this week, one night each, meaning tonight, satisfaction, freedom, identity, and hope. And of course, it's not just an intellectual exercise. I do think you just simply need to know a major part of the future. This is the future. If you go to London or New York, you can see with your own eyes that the future of the world is, maybe there's certain parts will get more secular, but many other parts will not. The future of the world is a polarized world when it comes to religion, not a religionless future. And if you want to understand that world, I think if you come out here, I think you'll understand it better. But of course, I want you to consider it personally too, because these are human needs. These are your needs. You need meaning and satisfaction and freedom and identity and hope. And maybe you will find that this not only explains, Christianity not only explains it extremely well, but offers maybe unparalleled resources to meet those needs. So what I'm going to do each night is I'm going to read you a text from the Bible. I'm going to try to uncover the particular theme for that night from that text. When I read you this text, I will not be, you might say, unpacking it fully. I'm going to choose some themes from the text and show how those themes shed light on our topic. But what I'm going to read you for tonight, when we're going to be looking at the idea of meaning in life, is John chapter 1, the first 5 verses, and then 3 verses later on, verses 14 to 17. So John chapter 1, verses 1 to 5 and 14 to 17. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended it. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Out of his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. This passage indicates 3 things. That there's a meaning in life that is discovered, there's a meaning in life that is created, and there's a meaning in life who discovers us. There's a meaning in life that's discovered, a meaning in life that's created, and a meaning in life who discovers us. First, there's a meaning in life that's that's discovered. In the most obvious thing, if you've never heard even this text read before, the most obvious thing about it is that John is talking about something called the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He uses the word 4 times in the text, in the passage. And of course, since he wrote in Greek, he was using a Greek word. And that Greek word was the word logos. And John deliberately uses a word that had an enormous amount of cultural and philosophical freight at the time. Because the ancient Greek philosophers had talked about a logos, and they meant by the logos a spiritual cosmic order or structure behind the material universe. So that if you could discern what the logos was, you would understand the meaning or the reason, logos, the reason for existence, the reason for life, the reason for the universe. To get the gist of it, just imagine this. I'm going to have, because I'm American, Americans and English people are united by divided by a common language. And the big words we all believe in, but it's words like truck or lorry or lift or elevator. These are the things that divide us and why we can't get along as well as we could otherwise. And do you say space heater? Room heater? You know, the little heater that's in our hotel room in case the central heating isn't working very well and you plug it in. What do you call that? A heater. Americans are just, we overly complexify things. All right. We call it a room heater or a space heater. So now let's just say you've plugged your space heater in, and you're in the bathtub, and you say, the water isn't hot enough. I'd like to heat my bath water with this heater. And you put the heater in. What will happen? You will die. And you will die because it's not designed to heat bath water. In fact, if you plug it into the wrong power source, you might burn down your flat. And you better read the directions. And the directions actually are an expression of the logos of the heater. That is, the people who design the heater designed it to work in certain ways. There's a purpose, there's a reason for the heater's existence. And if you don't align your use of it with the designer's purpose for it, you will destroy yourself, electrocute yourself, burn down your flat, whatever. And so the Greek philosophers said, well, what if there's a logos? There is a logos, they believe, to the universe itself. And what that means is if we could discern it and we live in accordance with it, if we could align ourselves with it, then finally we would be living along the grain of the universe, as it were. We would be living in a way that as life was meant to be lived. And if we didn't align ourselves with the meaning of life as far as this cosmic order behind the universe, if we didn't live according to that, we'd in a sense burn our life down. And so though the different philosophy, obviously every school, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Neoplatonists, Plotinus, Aristotle, they all had different takes on it, but they all believed there was a sense, there were moral norms, there were moral absolutes, there was a kind of cosmic spiritual order behind the material universe, and you had to discover that. It was objective meaning. It was out there. You didn't make it up. You had to discover it, and you had to align your life with it. And John is saying, the gospel writer John, Christian writer, is saying, that's right, there is a logos. There is a spiritual order to the universe that you must align your life with. That's the first thing we see from the text. The second thing that the text indicates, and it's more of a hint, but it's a delicious hint, is in verse 5 where it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended it. Now, the word light in the Bible is a metaphor for truth, very common metaphor for truth. And what we're being told here is the truth comes into the world, but the world doesn't comprehend it. Now, some translations will say the world has not understood it. And sometimes it says the world has not overcome it. And a friend of mine who's a New Testament scholar, Don Carson, actually says that this Greek word that John uses here, he says, is a masterpiece of planned ambiguity. Because what it's getting across is the fact that we have a deeply ambivalent attitude toward truth. There's a sense in which we want truth, and on the other hand, we don't like it being imposed on us. And because of that, we live in an era that I don't think John could have probably even imagined, in which what we actually have is, we live in an era, a culture, Western culture, in which this deeply ambivalent attitude toward truth is very much in play. Because on the one hand, I'm going to read you two perfectly good examples of secular thinkers who say there is and there is not meaning in life. So for example, Stephen Jay Gould, who was a paleontologist at Harvard and a public intellectual, some years ago, actually in 1988, Life magazine, an American magazine, asked a group of different thinkers, what's the meaning of life? And Stephen Jay Gould said this: we are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures. We're here because the Earth never froze entirely during an ice age. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating. We must construct these answers for ourselves. And then Jerry Coyne, more recently, he's a professor of biology at University of Chicago. And like Stephen Jay Gould he'd call himself an atheist. Jerry Coyne put it like this. He says, the cosmos doesn't have one iota of evidence for a purpose or for a God. So secularists don't see a universe without apparent purpose. Pardon me. Secularists see a universe without apparent purpose and realize that we must forge our own purposes and ethics. But although the universe is purposeless, our lives aren't. We make our own purposes, and they're real. Now that I'm not having to read my notes, I can tell you what he just said. In both cases, they said there is no purpose of life. I mean, because we're just here. No one made us. There's no logos. There's no objective out there meaning in life that we have to align ourselves with. There's no meaning in life we discover because we were not made for a purpose. We're not like the heater. We're just here. And yet, they both say, but you still need to have purpose in life. And you can create that purpose. You can decide what you want to live for. You want to live to be a good parent for your children. You want to live to fight hunger in Africa. You decide what the purpose is. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould says it's liberating. There's no purpose that you have to discover because we're not here for any purpose. In a sense, there's no purpose to human life. But there can be purpose to your life, and you create it. Isn't that liberating? There's the ambivalence, see. There is no truth, and yet we need something to live for. There is no meaning in life, and yet you need to have your own meaning in life. There are some people who've said, no, wait a minute, let's get over this. If you're a secular person and you realize that we're not created, we're not here for any particular reason, get over the idea of needing meaning in life. You shouldn't need meaning in life, but you do. A recent book in the States, which is a big bestseller, is called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. He teaches medicine at Harvard Med School, and he's also a working surgeon in Boston. And in there, he tells a story about a man who was the director of a nursing home in upstate New York. And he saw his nursing home patients withering and dying. These were aging patients, old patients. And he came up with an idea. And he did an end run around the local health inspectors. And he brought in pets, dogs, cats, parrots, parakeets. He brought in plants, all sorts of exotic plants, created a vegetable garden, created a flower garden, didn't ask anybody's permission, on every floor, so that all the residents suddenly had a garden to attend to, or a parrot to feed, or a dog or a cat to feed. And over the next couple of years, you should have seen what annual deaths went down 20%. Psychotropic drug prescriptions went down 50%, 38%. It was a triumph. Why? And what he says is, people need meaning in life. And what does that mean? Feeding a pet. Just to have, and here's how he defined it. Meaning in life is I've got a purpose and I make a difference. Something I do lives beyond my life. I have a purpose and it makes a difference. So if I do anything that I know lives on beyond me, I feel like I've got a purpose. And if I don't have a purpose, I die. So we need meaning in life, but what we're being told in our culture, certainly in a secular culture, is there's no discovered meaning, objective meaning out there that I've got to align myself with. There's only created meaning. There's only meaning that I decide for myself. And I make a purpose, and it might be feeding a pet. It might be raising a child. It might be trying to do something for public justice in the world today. But it's going to live on beyond me. It's going to make a difference. Because if I'm superfluous, if nothing I do really matters and nothing I do makes any difference, then I have no meaning in life. And you've got to live with meaning in life. So we need meaning in life. And secular people said, well, you can have meaning in life. You create it. You create it. Question. Is it true that if there's no God and there's no meaning in life for the human race, can you still have meaning in life? Even without belief in God or anything beyond this world and this life, can you have meaning in life? And my answer to you is yes and no. But a bigger no than a yes. I hope I'm being fair, and you probably may not, but okay, we're here. It's Oxford. You can ask questions. I can give you answers. We can go back and forth. But I'd like to say, I think if you say, I'm a secular person, I don't believe in God, I don't believe I'm here for a purpose, but I can have meaning in life, my answer to you is yes and no. I already gave you the yes. The yes is, there's empirical proof that if If you have something more important than just yourself, something more important than just clothing yourself and feeding yourself, something else you're living for, some other cause that maybe will outlive you, something you're doing for someone else besides yourself, meaning in life, and you live, and that nursing home is a perfect example of it. But here's 3 reasons why I'm going to press you on this. 3 reasons why I think that if you don't believe in God, or you don't believe in anything beyond this world or after this life, that your meaning in life is far less rational, far less durable, and far less morally and socially useful. Far less rational, far less durable, and far less morally and socially useful. Give me 5 minutes to unpack that, all right? First of all, far less rational. I know that sounds strange for a Christian to say to people who out there who might be secular, that I do think Christianity is much more rational when it comes to meaning in life. What do I mean? Well, let me give you a couple more quotes, and let's see if I can read them. Thomas Nagel, NYU professor, very prominent guy, puts it like this in his little book, A Very Short Intro to Philosophy, and he has a chapter called The Meaning of Life, and in there he says this: even if you produce a great work of literature, which continues to be read thousands of years from now, eventually the solar system will cool, or the universe will wind down and collapse, and all trace of your effort will vanish. It wouldn't matter if you had never existed, and after you've gone out of existence, it won't matter that you did exist. If one's life is supposed to have a point as part of something larger, it's always possible to ask, what's the point of that? C.S. Lewis wrote this: if nature is all that exists, in other words, if there's no God and no life of some other sort somewhere outside of nature, then all stories will end in the same way, in a universe from which all life is banished without the possibility of return. If civilization is all there is, human civilization, there's no afterlife, no God, no supernatural. If civilization is all there is, then civilization will have been an accidental flicker. There will be no one even to remember it. No doubt atomic bombs may cut short its duration on this present planet, but the whole thing, even if human civilization lasted for millions of years, will be so infinitesimally short in relation to the oceans of dead time which precede and follow it that I cannot feel excited about its curtailment. And French philosopher Luc Ferry has a section in his book on A Brief History of Thought in which he does what Tom Nagel says you can always ask. If you don't believe in God, you don't believe in anything beyond this world, you can always ask the question, what's the point of that? He calls it l'essence du sens. And here's what he means. He says, everything has to have a point, right? A purpose, a meaning. So why are you exercising? Well, the point of exercise is to keep my health good. What's the point of the health? So I can work. What's the point of work? So I can make money, so I can care for my family. And what Luc Ferry says is, l'essence du sens is, you can always say, what's the point of that? Until you get to a place where it's pointless. Why? Because here's, in the end, if this life is all there is, and there is no God, and this world is all there is, in the end, it will not matter whether you're a genocidal maniac or an altruist. It won't matter whether you fight hunger in Africa or some other poor place, or whether you're just incredibly cruel and greedy capitalist and you're just making money and you're starving the poor. It won't matter, because in the end, not only will nothing you do make any difference, but eventually nobody will be around to remember what you've done, and eventually nobody will be around to remember that there is civilization. In the end, it makes no difference. And what Nagel and Ferry are being, they're just being consistent. They're being philosophers. They're simply saying, even if you say there's a point to this that I'm doing and it's a point to this, eventually it's pointless. You can always ask, what's the point of that? What's the point of that? And in the end, it's pointless. Now you say, well, yeah, they're philosophers. And they think like that. I'm not going to think like that. I'm going to say, I'm raising a child, or I'm working here. I don't want to have to think cosmically like that. Well, it might break in on you. And here's what I mean. Tolstoy, in 1879, Tolstoy wrote his Confession. And in the Confession, he talks about something that happened to him when he turned 50. He said he had a wife who loved him, he had good children, he had a large estate, which without much effort on my part improved and increased. He said, I was respected, and then he came to the place where he said, I realized I could give no rational meaning to any single action in my life. How's that? He says, today or tomorrow, sickness and death will come. They come already to many people that he loved, but it will come to me, and nothing will remain but stench and worms. He says, sooner or later, my affairs, whatever they may be, will be forgotten, and I will not exist. Then why go on making any effort? How can we fail to see this, he says. That's what's surprising. One can only live while one is intoxicated with life. As soon as one is sober, it's impossible not to see that it's all mere fraud or a stupid fraud. There's nothing either amusing or witty about it. My question, which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man, a question without an answer to which one cannot live. It was this. What will come of what I'm doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? It can also be expressed thus. Is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? Now, here's what Tolstoy is saying. And if you're a Christian, and for argument's sake, would you imagine believing Christianity for a minute? Just imagine. And you're having a terrible day, or you're having a terrible month, you're having a terrible year. How do you deal with that? One of the ways to do it is to think out the implications of what you believe about the universe. If you really believe Christianity, you say, well, you know, there's a God who made me in love, and even though I failed him, he sent his son into the world to redeem me. And now, because his Spirit lives in me, and he's promised someday to take me to be with him, and someday even to renew the whole earth, and there's the resurrection of the body, and to create a new heavens and new earth. And that means that ultimately, the worst that can happen to me right now, which is I die, would be the best thing that could happen to me. And even all these good outcomes are absolutely certain, and the best is yet to come. How does a Christian deal with trouble? By thinking, being rational, thinking out the implications of what we believe about the universe. Tolstoy said that when he didn't believe there was anything outside of this world, the more he thought about the implications of his actual view of life, the sadder he got. And it kept breaking in on him. Now here's my only point, first of the 3 points, is if you really believe there's no discovered meaning in life, only created meaning in life, then if you really start to think globally, the fact that nothing you do is going to make any difference in the end, well, of course you're going to be upset because you're thinking out the implications of your view of life. You're thinking out the implications of your worldview. Well, you don't have to think as much, but that's what I'm saying. It's not a very rational way to have meaning in life. It's less rational than discovered meaning. It's less rational. Secondly, it's less durable. What do I mean by that? Less durable? If you've created your meaning rather than discovered it and aligned with it, if you created your own meaning, then your meaning in life is some point in this life. There's something in this life that you said, I'm living for that. I'm living for my family. I'm living for this cause. I'm living for this political cause or something like that. And that means that suffering, when it comes, can destroy your meaning in life, totally destroy it. If you're living for your pet, if you're living for your pet dies, your child dies, you have no meaning in life left. But if your meaning in life is actually something outside this world, if your meaning in life is to know God, to please God, to be with God, suffering can actually get you in that direction. It can actually enhance your meaning in life. It can get you closer to Him. So Viktor Frankl, for example, who was a Jewish doctor who was put into the death camps during World War II, and he survived. And afterwards, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, he talked about the fact that he could see under the terrible, horrendous conditions of the death camps, people reacted and responded in 3 ways. Some people just became evil. Some good people became evil. They started collaborating with the enemy. They just became bad. Some people just lost hope. They just sometimes literally curled up in a ball and died. But he says some people stayed noble, brave, self-sacrificing, And when he got out, he tried to figure out what the difference was, and he decided it had all to do with what their meaning in life was. He says, if you have a meaning in life that the death camp can take away from you, and think about that. If your meaning in life is your career, or money, or your family, or some political cause, or your looks, if your meaning in life is anything that a death camp can take away from you, and any created meaning is, then you either become evil or you shrivel up and die. He discovered that the people who were able to keep with it generally were people who had a meaning in life that was some transcendent reference point. In some cases, it was traditional religion, and he saw a lot of Jewish people in the camp actually go back to traditional religion and prayers. But he even remembered one guy who simply said, my wife's in heaven because she's dead, and she's looking down at me, and I want to make her proud of me, and that's my meaning in life. And even that transcendent reference point made it possible for him to survive death camps. Could you? I don't believe any created meaning in life, something that you just decide is there, because there's nothing beyond this world, is durable. And anthropologists will say Western societies are the worst societies in the history of the world at preparing people for suffering and death. Because created meaning is not only less rational, it's less durable. Lastly, it's way, way, way less useful for, I said morally and socially useful. What do I mean by that? Some years ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education, an American paper it's a periodical actually for educators, and in the Chronicle there was an article by a woman who was an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist at a college in Rhode Island, I think, and she was doing a lot of studies of certain cultures in Africa. And one of the problems that she had was that she found the cultures very oppressive to women. And she began to push back and question how those cultures treated women. And she talked to some of the leaders in that culture, and she suddenly realized she was in trouble. She says, and she writes this in the article, she wrote it, she said, as a secular person, I believe there are no mind-independent values. And by that, she meant, I don't believe there really are any moral absolutes. I don't believe there's something out there objectively that I've got to align with. I believe that all moral values are person-specific or culturally constructed, that every culture has its own values and no one culture is better than any other culture, and there's no moral absolutes by which we decide this culture is good, this culture is bad. And yet when she showed up in these places and started saying, wait a minute, you need to treat women better, they looked at her and said, don't put your white Western values on us, all that egalitarian stuff. You know that every culture has its own values, and you have no basis for saying that your culture is better than our culture. You have no basis for saying that your moral truths are right and ours are not. And by the way, we just happen to think that these people need to be controlled. And she was incredibly frustrated. And here's the reason why. If there is no God, you can explain moral feeling. You have moral feelings, I have moral feelings. Maybe they're the result of evolutionary biology, and these feelings helped our ancestors survive. Maybe this is our culture. If there's no God, there certainly can be moral feelings, and people can be very moral in their behavior. But if there's no God, there's no basis for moral obligation. Moral obligation is saying, you need to stop doing that in spite of how you feel about it. Because as soon as you do that, here's what Friedrich Nietzsche would say. Nietzsche would come to you and say, oh, so you don't believe there's a God, and yet you believe in human rights and that we should care for the poor? He says, you're still being Christians, and you just won't admit it. Because the fact of the matter is, there is no moral obligation. There's a Russian philosopher that put Nietzsche's argument very well, Solovyov, who said, man descended from apes, therefore, let us love one another. What Nietzsche would say is, that does not follow. If you got here through the strong eating the weak, if that's the natural order of things, how dare you say that it's wrong when the rest of us do it? And what that woman discovered is, yeah, she had a meaning in life. She was working. She decided that she was going to work for this or work for that. But because she didn't believe in a logos, because she didn't believe in a discovered meaning, a meaning that she had to align with, she had no basis for saying to somebody else, you need to stop doing that. She had a meaning in life, but it was actually morally and socially useless, less durable, and less rational. So if Christianity was true, what would the meaning in life be? Because up to now, and I'm only going to be brief on this, but up to now, I have shown you that if you don't believe in God, you have created meaning that I think that you're at a great disadvantage in many, many ways. But I haven't really talked to you that much about what Christianity offers beyond some other religion, and here's what I'll just say at the end. You remember how it said at the end of the text, "And the Word became flesh and dwelled among us, and we beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." There's three things that John is saying there that I would like to, I'll tell you two now, and after we do, listen to one student give an account of her spiritual journey, and we do a question and answer, I'll come back and explain it. But here's the first. John says three things about the Logos. Number one is the Logos is a person. Do you realize how incredible that is? The Logos is a person. John is saying, yes, like the Greek philosophers, I believe there is a structure behind the universe that we need to get in touch with and we need to align ourselves with if we're going to be living along the grain of the universe. But it's not a set of abstract principles that you have to use your philosophical acumen to discern. It's a person. It's a person, Jesus Christ, and to have a personal relationship with him. That's how you get in touch with the universe. Do you realize how egalitarian that was? It was a bombshell in the history of human thought. The idea that the Logos is there, but a person. There's a meaning in life that has to be discovered. No, it's a meaning in life who's a person, and if I enter into a relationship with that person, I'm in connection with the meaning of the universe. That doesn't take us to philosopher to know. Anybody can do that. It's egalitarian. It's incredibly personal. It's not cold and abstract. Suddenly, the universe isn't a kind of impersonal thing. It's the creation of a personal God. The Logos is a personal. Think of how radical that was. But secondly, the Logos actually comes to us. You know, maybe some of you have heard me say this before either. Years ago, when Dorothy Sayers wrote her Lord Peter Wimsey novels, the first number of novels and stories, he had no love interest. You know, he's an aristocratic detective, and about halfway through the Lord Peter Wimsey stories, suddenly a woman shows up. What's interesting is, as many of you know, Dorothy Sayers was one of the early female graduates of Oxford, and she wrote detective fiction. And Harriet Vane shows up and falls in love with Peter Wimsey, and they get married. Harriet Vane was one of the first women graduates of Oxford, according to the fictional narrative, and she wrote detective fiction. And some people say Dorothy Sayers looked into her created world and fell in love with her lonely hero and wrote herself into the story to save him. And that's kind of sweet. I mean, Americans would have gone, "Oh, but you're British." They would have gone, "Oh, but you're British." But there's something way greater than that. According to John, that's exactly what happened. God creates us, we turn away from him, that's the biblical narrative, and God looks into the world he's created, sees we need salvation, and writes himself into the story. And when you have a meaning in life, not that you have to use all of your intellectual contemplative powers to somehow discern and never be sure whether you've got it right. Instead, if you have a meaning in life who's a person who comes and discovers you, and that answers the problem. Remember what I said before, that we're ambivalent. Why? Because we want truth, but we don't want a truth that's imposed on us. We don't like the loss of our freedom. We don't want a truth that's imposed on us. But a love relationship changes that. When I was falling in love with my wife, I wanted her to love me, and I wanted to change for her. And I would go to her and I'd say, "Is there anything that you want me to change?" And she had her list. I remember one of the things on the early part of the list was, I am in England, so I'll be more delicate. Maybe I should say matters of personal hygiene. And when she told me about it, these were the sort of things that my mother and father had talked to me about, and I had said, "Don't you dare tell me how to live my life." When Kathy said, "This is what I'd like you to change," I said, "Okay." Because in a sense, when you're falling in love with somebody, you want to please that person, and that's not meaning you create. It's something you discover. You want to please that person. That person says, "These are things I want you to do." But to give them to the person you love doesn't feel like an imposition. It feels like life itself. Life itself. And see, that's what's so different about Christianity. The meaning of life isn't the 10 Commandments, though you should obey the 10 Commandments. The meaning of life isn't just, hoping to please your wife so when you go to heaven she'll be proud of you. That's closer, frankly. But this is talking about a person that comes into your life and says, know me, and you're in touch with the universe, but do the things. There's norms, of course. There's things you're supposed to do if you're a Christian, but do it because you love me. Do it because of what I've done for you when I came to earth, went to the cross, and died for you. Yeah, there's a hymn writer, 17th century American hymn writer, has got a Christmas carol. And one of the verses goes like this: seek not in courts or palaces, nor royal curtains draw, but search the stable, see your God extended on the straw. Your God extended on the straw. That changed history, and that'll change your life. The Logos is a person, and a love relationship is the meaning with him, is the meaning in life. Now, you're going to see right now a short account by an Oxford student about her own spiritual journey, and after that, we're going to come and I'm going to answer questions, and so you can begin to text your questions in to that number, and after that I'm going to take as many as I possibly can in a few minutes, and then I'll wrap up and we'll call it a night.
Growing up, my whole identity was defined by the fact that I was really good at history. I was one of the geeky kids at school. When I arrived at Oxford, I felt like I made it in life. Here I was surrounded by all these people equally geeky as me, who all loved learning as much as I did. I felt like I had breezed through my time at Oxford as I had at school. But that optimism was very quickly crushed when I received my first essay feedback, and with it I felt like my whole identity was threatened. Nonetheless, I made many friends for life that term, and I grew particularly close to my college brother. However, there was a catch. He was becoming more and more interested in all that Christian stuff. I'd never been to church before, but I was certain that all Christians were weird and unfriendly. But to spend more time with him, I went to a couple of the CU meals in our college during that Michaelmas term, and I was baffled. Here were the most welcoming group of people I had ever met in my life. In my second term, one of my tutors told me that in order to study medieval history, we had to have a really good knowledge of the Bible and the Christian church. I decided that I would try to read some of the Bible, and that I would go to church, as I decided that this would be the easiest way to find out a bit more. However, after going to church that Sunday, I didn't return for another 4 months. The sermon was on, is Jesus the only way to God? And I immediately took offence to the preacher's line of argument. He stated that Jesus was indeed the only way to God, and having been brought up in a multicultural context, I found this really shocking. Later on, my college brother had become a Christian, and I was furious. I decided to go back to church and began to go to some of the events put on by the Christian Union to discover exactly what he was hearing and to try and prove him wrong. However, rather than challenging his beliefs, I found that my own beliefs were being challenged. In particular, I was shocked by the remarkable evidence for the resurrection and the historicity of the Bible. This shook me, as I thought historically none of it was viable. I discovered that if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then his claims to be God suddenly held a lot more weight. As a historian, I was determined to follow the evidence where it led, and so I prayed my first prayer. God, if you're real, and I don't know if you are, please help me to come to know you. I became convinced that God answered that prayer, but then came the first real test, my prelims. Now that I was no longer the best historian, I felt like a bit of a failure. I didn't really know who I was anymore, but I'd heard that Jesus could help me with that too. I just had to ask. To this day, I've never felt so consistently calm in a set of exams as I did that year, because I knew that God had it all under control. It was unbelievable to know that the God who created the whole universe cared about me.
Do we have a working microphone? Tremendous. Great. So we have a few minutes now for some of the questions that you've been texting in before Tim wraps up with a few thoughts. I'm afraid we're going to have to share this microphone again, Tim. But in the meantime, should we have our first question up? Isn't humanism a perfectly conceivable, non-religious, transcendental goal?
Uh, it certainly is conceivable. It certainly is non-religious. I don't know what you mean by transcendental, but I don't think so. Because as far as I know, transcendent versus immanent, humanism is immanent. Humanism says that all value has to happen within the framework of this world. We don't look at some transcendent source. Confucius believed in something called heaven. It was something beyond this world. Of course, Buddhism thinks that the physical world is an illusion. The Greeks believed in the logos. All of them had a transcendent reference point. As far as I know, secular humanism, I think that's what you mean. If you talk about Christian humanism, it doesn't really make much sense as a question. So I'm assuming you're talking about secular humanism, and secular humanism, no, doesn't have a transcendent goal. My point about Nietzsche, let me draw it out just for a second. Nietzsche said, if there is no transcendent reality, if all we have is the immanent, if all we have is this life, then how can you take any one part of life and put it over another part of life? As soon as someone says, this is good and this is bad, where do you get that? He says, unless you have a transcendent reference point, you can't judge part of life good and part of life bad. You have to embrace all of life as it is. That was Nietzsche. And I don't think frankly, I don't think secular humanism has any kind of answer for him. I think he's absolutely right. Because there's no transcendent reference point, you can't say, you essentially have to accept life, and you can't pick and choose and say, this kind of life is good, this kind of life is bad. Nietzsche would say that secular humanism, because it believes in human rights, it believes in the dignity of every person, it believes that you shouldn't starve the poor, and you should do universal benevolence for everyone, you should be trying to make the world a good place for everyone. He would say, you're not going to read that out of the facts of nature. You will never read that out of the facts of nature. All you see there is nature red in tooth and claw. He says, you've gotten that from Christianity and you won't admit it. That's Nietzsche, and I think he's right. So I don't believe that humanism it's very conceivable, and it's non-religious, and most Christians probably find that most of the ideals of humanism they would agree with, but no, it's not transcendent.
If there is a logos, why do some people live so well without it? I would not get far denying gravity, so why can I live well without your so-called logos?
Well, that's a great question, too. I could answer it. Now, the Christian answer, well, no, I won't give you the Christian answer first. I began to answer that question in my answer to the last question. Nietzsche would say that most secular people think, for example, that human rights is just self-evident. He would say, no, that basically it's self-evident to Western individualistic people, and by and large, your Western individualism is a heritage of Christianity. For example, in India, it's illegal to commit suicide. In Japan, it's illegal. I believe sometimes there are legal penalties for the family. And many Westerners say that's just horrible. You have if you want to kill yourself, you have the right to do that. So much of what many people in the West think of as self-evident good values really have come down from Christianity, and many other parts of the world do not share those. So it seems like this question sort of assumes that without religion, goodness is self-evident. It's just not. And I think in some ways you've lived your life perhaps a little bit in the Western bubble that says our values are not something that we just got from Christianity. Our values are self-evident to anyone who just uses their reason. And so I think that might be the answer to the probably the answer. The Christian answer, I'd say, without assuming Christianity, I would say, at least in the West, people are still being influenced by the consensus of Judeo-Christian values. But as a Christian, I'll tell you what I think. And the answer is we believe in something called common grace. And common grace is the fact that even though not all human beings are believing Christians, of course, nor are all human beings believers in God, we think all human beings were made in the image of God. We believe all human beings were made in the imago Dei, which means that all human beings have a sort of, we believe, deep knowledge of right and wrong, that is there whether you believe in God or not. And so we're not surprised, we Christians are not surprised to see lots and lots of people living well without it, that they sense, in some ways it's like gravity, they sense right and wrong out there, even if, as Nietzsche shows, they have no particular basis in their view of the world for it, but they still sense the rightness or wrongness of it. We would say it's a common grace that God gives to all human beings, whether or not they're believing Christians or not.
Just because it's rational, stroke durable, stroke useful, stroke nice, stroke comfortable, doesn't make it true. Has Christianity not just fashioned a God to avoid accepting that really we have no meaning?
Well, I'm really glad somebody took notes, because those definitely were my points, and I feel that's a compliment, and I appreciate that very much. No, I agree that tonight, I am showing you tonight more a reason why you should want to explore whether Christianity was true. If at the end of this week, for example, if you come every night this week, or you come many nights, or get a hold of the material, and if you say, you know, Christianity really does create a meaning in life that would be pretty remarkable. It's rational, it's durable, it's useful, and not only that, it's based, nice and comfortable is a slightly pejorative way of talking about my last point, I think, which is to say the idea that you have moral norms embedded in a love relationship as opposed to just abstract principles. If you say, you know, that sounds attractive. Satisfaction. If I show you that Christianity gives you tremendous resources for those things, it's true that along the way I am not saying that proves Christianity is true, but it should at least indicate that you should care whether it's true or not. In fact, if you really say, hasn't Christianity just fashioned a God to avoid accepting that really we have no meaning? Yeah, maybe, but how can you be so sure? Maybe you've worked it all out. So I'm just showing, I would say in a place like Oxford and Manhattan, people aren't motivated to find out whether Christianity is true. Because I started by saying people think it's a spent force, and I'm trying to show you there's a whole lot more heft to it than you think. I am not actually doing what you might call traditional case for why Christianity is true in these evening meetings. I'm not doing that. However, I am trying to show you in many cases that, that if you're a secular person who thinks that God has just been fashioned, I want you to see that you're not just simply being objective and rational. You're living your life on the basis of a set of beliefs that are not self-evident to everyone in the world, that are no more empirically based than religious beliefs, and that have all kinds of problems in them. For example, the idea that there's human rights but there's no God. If you're the kind of person that believes that, Nietzsche says you've got profound problems. Human rights make more sense if there's a God. And if you think they're true, they're really there, if you have a premise that there's no God, that leads you to a conclusion you know isn't true, that human beings can be bought and sold, like Nietzsche would say, then why not change the premise? So I'm not arguing directly for Christianity being true. I'm trying to show you that you should want to find out, and I'm trying to show you some of the ways in which Christianity has better truth claims than some of the claims of secular reason. But I'm not doing the traditional tonight. I just didn't do it. And I'm trying to take about 2 or 3 minutes on each of these questions. I can't give it to you now. If you come back and ask, if you ask more questions, I may be able to give you more sketches. And there are a couple nights in which I'll get closer to answering that question, but I can't do any more than that right now.
If heaven is so perfect and life so full of suffering, then what is the purpose of life?
If life is so full of suffering, what's the purpose of life? Again, let me refrain from doing the direct Christian answer. Every other religion, by the way, I hate to do this. A couple years ago, I wrote a book on suffering, and the first third of the book is speaking to this. Every religion, practically, has a role for suffering in the purpose of life. So the most obvious one, for example, of course, is the karmic religions actually think that if you're suffering, it's because of something you did wrong in a past life, and by handling suffering well in this life and living a good life, you actually get better reincarnations, and eventually you get out of you get off of the merry-go-round altogether, and you finally leave and get into bliss. And the good thing about one of the great things about the karmic religions is there's never unjust suffering. Never. If you're suffering now, it's because you did something bad in the past. And frankly, karmic religions really explain suffering quite well and say suffering is here as a test, as a way of not only, it's partly a punishment for what you did in the past, and it's a test for you to get into bliss. Christianity, of course, doesn't see it like that. Christianity believes that suffering is, your suffering is not necessarily caused by what you have done, but that suffering in general is caused by the human race turning from God. So suffering in general is our fault, but not specifically. And that's the reason why I think Christianity's view of suffering is remarkably balanced. Because on the one hand, it keeps you from just feeling like so furious because all suffering is undeserved, but it's not as fatalistic, for example, as the karmic religions that say all suffering is deserved. It's kind of a mixture. And if the purpose of life is to know God and to become like Him, then you might say if Jesus Christ brought redemption into the world through suffering, if He brought about something incredibly great through something as bad as suffering, then if I'm faithful to God in my suffering, Christians say, somehow that will be redemptive too. That doesn't mean I'll be saving the world. It doesn't even mean I'm necessarily having my own sins forgiven. I'm not saying that. But I will become more and more like God. I'll become more and more like the one who suffered for me. I'll become more and more kind and caring to other people. Frankly, most of the haughty people I know and unkind people I know and people who are very, very unempathetic are people who've never suffered. Generally, when I see people like that, I say, your time will come. You're either young enough that you haven't suffered yet, or you've lived a charmed life, and it's one of the worst things for you. Therefore, Christianity, every religion but secularism says that suffering is part of the purpose of life. And I just gave you a little glimpse of what it would be in a Christian worldview. But only secularism actually says there's no meaning to suffering. All suffering does is destroy meaning. By the way, eventually the Bible teaches that in the last part of Revelation, you notice that the city of God comes down out of heaven. It's coming down to earth. And so eventually what happens is not so much that we're going up, even though when you die, I believe you go to heaven. I'm a Christian minister. But at the very end of time, heaven comes down, destroys suffering, and the world somehow will be more glorious. The glory we have will be more glorious because of how suffering and evil has been overcome through Christ.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for Q&A this evening. If you do have further questions, then as Tim mentioned and as we'll hear, there are further talks this week that might be useful to you. There's also a bookstall at the back you'll notice on your way out, which has a number of titles which will be helpful for thinking through some of the issues that Tim has raised. Well, I'm going to hand over to Tim now to wrap up the evening.
Thank you for being patient. I mentioned that passage, which of course I've just barely touched on. It's a very rich passage. Says three things about the Logos. John says that the Logos is a person, not just an abstract principle. Secondly, the Logos isn't something that we necessarily discover as much as it comes and discovers us. He comes and discovers us. That God has written himself into our story, and the Son of God has come to earth. Now, the one thing I didn't talk much about, except only in glancing, is what he came to earth to do. And what I want to do in the rest of the week, the rest of the evenings this week, is talk more about that. But did you remember what I said when I read the passage where it said that we beheld his glory? Glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And it talked about the fact that he gives us a grace and truth. The law came through Moses, but we get grace and truth. Probably that statement about God's glory and the reference to Moses is supposed to make us think about a place in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the book of Exodus, where at one point Moses says to God, "Show me your glory." This is looking at tomorrow night here. We are all dissatisfied. We're all living with a lack of satisfaction. Moses had a sense that if he saw God's glory, his absolute beauty, that would be perhaps the thing he was looking for all of his life. He tried to find it in marriage, he tried to find it in politics, he tried to find it in career, but he said, show me your glory. And God says, I can't, it will kill you. And yet here, in John chapter 1, through Jesus Christ, we beheld his glory, glories of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The key, how could that be? The key is probably the fact where the Greek text is translated, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Hebrew word there is a very unusual word. It's the word tabernacled. It literally, he pitched his tent. He tabernacled among us. And it seems to be a reference to Jesus being the tabernacle. In the Old Testament, in Israel, the tabernacle and the temple was the place where God's holy Shekinah glory presence dwelt, in the Holy of Holies, behind the curtain, behind the veil, and no one could go back there, only the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It was a way of saying God's glory is not something that can come into your life because there's a gap between God and us. There's a chasm. We failed him. There's guilt. There's things like that. But that by Jesus Christ becoming the tabernacle so that we can now see his glory, Jesus, in a sense, is the priest that ends all priests. He's the temple that ends all temples. He's the sacrifice that ends all sacrifices. And somehow the glory, the power of God can come into our life in a way that could never have happened otherwise. Bridges that gap. An Anglican minister I know some years ago told a story. He said, in the early days of Christianity, he could imagine a Roman neighbor to a Christian coming over and saying, I understand you're a Christian. And the Roman neighbor says, I'm a Christian. And the Christian says, yes. The neighbor says, well, I love religions. I love the pageantry. Tell me more about your religion. Where are your temples? And a Christian would say, we don't have a temple. Jesus is our temple. He tabernacled among us. Oh, well, that doesn't make much sense. So the Roman neighbor says, well, where do your priests work? Well, we don't have a priest. Jesus is our priest. Really, says the Roman neighbor. Well, where do you offer sacrifices to curry favor with your God? And the Christian would say, well, we don't have any more sacrifices. Jesus is our sacrifice. And more than that, we don't have a remote God that we have to somehow curry favor with or even figure out. Jesus is the God who's come to discover us. And probably at that point, the Roman neighbor would say, what kind of religion is this? And probably the right answer is, it's really not exactly a religion, at least not as human beings think of religion. It's not really a religion. It's a divine person. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. We're going to explore how he bridged that gap and what it means that he's the final tabernacle and temple in the coming weeks. Right now, Josh is going to come up and he's going to close us up, right?